They sold her for 14 silver marks. Not to a merchant, not to a tradesman who needed labor and had coin to spare. They sold her to a beta lord with cold eyes and a colder hall, to a man who had already decided what she was worth before he counted out the payment. The elders of Thornmere witnessed the contract. The torches burned low. And Caspian walked out of that hall in a borrowed white dress with 14 marks written in ink against her name, and not a single voice in the assembly spoke to stop it. She ran before the wedding night was done, and the man she ran to, the man whose arms she collapsed into without knowing whose they were, was the one person in the entire northern reach with the power to burn that contract to ash and salt the ground beneath it. He was the Alpha King, and before it was over, he would kneel. The year was 1247. The solstice eve came down on Thornmere like a stone lid pressing shut on something alive. Snow had been falling since midday, fine and relentless, packing the courtyard cobbles into a smooth gray sheet and sheeting the pine boughs until they bent. The great hall of Thornmere held 40 candles and a hearth the size of a cart, and still the cold lived in the upper stones, patient and permanent, as if fire had never really won that argument in this place, and never would. Caspian stood just inside the hall's threshold and watched the contract being read aloud for the third time. She had counted. Each reading was for a different audience. First for the pack elders in their furred collars, then for the 2 traders who had brokered the arrangement, and finally for the assembled household, the servants and guards and lesser wolves who would remember what they had witnessed. Her name was spoken 6 times in the document. Aldrich Vane's name appeared 11. She had counted that too, in the way that the mind seizes on small arithmetic when the larger numbers are too ugly to hold. Aldrich stood at the head of the assembly, one hand resting on the carved back of his chair in the manner of a man who owned every object in a room and preferred you to notice. He was not unpleasant to look at. That was the worst of it, in some ways, the way danger so often came, dressed in the ordinary. His jaw was clean, his furred mantle straight, his eyes pale as winter water and entirely without warmth. He had not looked at Caspian once during the reading. She was a line item. She already understood that. The contract cited her parentage as unknown, her rank as unregistered, her worth as purely contractual. 14 silver marks, to be paid to the Harrow estate trustee, the executor of her mother's debts. Her mother who had been a Luna once. Her mother whose line had been struck from the pack registry 2 years after her death, quietly, in administrative ink, by men who found it convenient that certain bloodlines not persist. Caspian had known about the erasure. Marin had told her, 5 years ago, in the small stone workroom behind the healer's cottage at the Thornmere edge, while they ground dried root, and Marin kept her voice low and her eyes on the doorway. Her mother's name was Vessa. She had stood in a hall like this one, and she had been chosen rather than sold, and it had made no difference in the end because the men who controlled the registry found choosing and selling to be largely the same transaction, dressed differently for different rooms. Caspian had filed that knowledge away and kept working. There was nothing else to do with it. She had been a healer's apprentice for 6 years by then, under Marin's patient instruction, learning to identify wolfsbane by its blue-green leaf edge, to distinguish silver burn from common fever by the smell of the wound, to compound a suppression tincture from black root and powdered alum that could slow a poison spread long enough for the body to fight. She had small hands and a precise memory, and she did not flinch. Marin said those were the necessary qualities, and Caspian had believed her. And she had been right about almost everything except that the skill would protect her from being sold. The chief elder rolled the contract, stamped it, and passed it to the contract broker. The hall exhaled in the collective way of witnesses released from formality. Aldrich finally looked at her then, a brief inventory, the same glance he might spare a piece of furniture about to be moved into a room he was redecorating. He nodded once. She nodded back. There was nothing in her face that she had not chosen to put there. The wedding was set for the following evening. If you have ever found yourself in a story that was moving towards something you could not stop, drop a word in the comments below and stay with her through what came next. She had one night to think. She spent it in a cold room on the upper floor of the keep, wrapped in the one good cloak she owned, sitting on the stone bench beneath the narrow window and looking at the frozen gorge below. The gorge ran northeast, along the base of the ridge, frozen solid in the upper reaches, but still moving at the center in a dark thread of current. She had crossed it once, in autumn, when Maren sent her to collect pale fungus from the far bank. She knew the crossing point, 300 yards north of the gate, where the ice was thickest and the stones below were flat. She knew which direction the gorge turned when it bent away from Thornmere's territory and into the unpatrolled borderland below the King's eastern ridge. She was not planning anything. She told herself that several times, watching the dark thread of water. By the time the solstice torches had burned down to stubs in the courtyard below, she had told herself that lie often enough to stop believing it, and had begun instead to inventory what she could carry. Her herbalist's kit, wrapped in oilcloth. Maren's last gift to her, a vial of blackroot concentrate, pressed into her hands a week earlier with only the words, "Keep it close," and a look that said far more than that. 2 days' worth of dried provision from the kitchen, taken carefully, nothing that would be missed before morning. Her own boots, which were good, made of oiled leather, and her own hands, which were steady. She waited until the second watch changed, and the hall below fell into its heaviest silence. Then she descended the servants' stair and crossed the frozen courtyard under a sky packed with low cloud, and she walked through the postern gate that the night warden always left unlatched because it was the way to the waste pits, and no one had thought to imagine a woman using it for something else. The gorge was colder than she remembered. The crossing point held. She did not look back. She walked for 4 hours through snow that came to her knees in the low stretches, through pine forest where the silence was so complete she could hear her own blood in her ears, through the borderland that sat between Thornmere's territory and the first markers of the King's Reach. She was not frightened. Or rather, she was frightened in the particular way that people are frightened when they have already decided and fear has become irrelevant. A passenger, rather than a driver. The border keep announced itself through the smell of wood smoke and hot iron, long before she could see the walls. She came up over a low rise into a clearing and stopped. The keep was black against the dark sky, its torches burning at 4 points, its walls square and unornamented, built for endurance rather than display. A wolf's head banner hung over the gate arch, unmoving in the still air. Caspian took 2 more steps and her legs stopped cooperating. She woke on a pallet of folded wool, close to a hearth, with the sound of a woman humming very quietly somewhere to her left. The ceiling above her was low stone, pale gray, mortared with care. The fire was built high and orange. She turned her head and found Maren. Not her Maren, she understood after a moment. This woman was older, her white hair close-cropped, her hands wrapped in the distinctive stained cloth of a compound worker, her eyes dark and currently fixed on Caspian with the specific expression of someone completing a diagnosis. "Nothing frozen," the old woman said. "2 toes close. They'll ache for a week." She set down the cup she had been holding and came to crouch beside the pallet. "I am called Maren. I keep the healing rooms in this hold. You came from the south." "From Thornmere," Caspian said. The old woman's face shifted in some way that was not quite readable. "When did you leave?" "Last night, before the wedding." Maren was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Caspian's hands, at the herbalist's kit visible in the folded cloak beside the pallet, at the vial tucked inside it. "You have healer's training." "6 years. Who taught you?" "A woman named Bryn, in the lower market. And before that, my mother." Marin nodded slowly, as if filing something, and rose. You will stay in these rooms until your feet are sound. After that, the keep's arrangements are the king's to decide. She paused at the hearth. His name is Rowan. He is not a gentle man, but he is a fair one, in his own way. Do not lie to him. He will know. Caspian absorbed this. Does he know I'm here? He will, when he returns from the Ridge Patrol. In the meantime, eat. The keep's lower hall was long and built of the same pale stone as the healing room, lit by iron sconces and by the light that fell from two high slit windows on the eastern wall, cold and thin and gray. When Caspian's feet allowed her to walk without clenching her jaw at each step, she made herself useful. The keep ran a lean household: 8 guards, marraines, 2 kitchen staff, and a succession of runners who came and went from the ridge markers. She learned the geography of it in 2 days, the way water moved through the hold, where the wood was stacked, which passages ran cold and which held their warmth from the lower heating stones. On the 3rd morning, she was carrying a bundle of dried herbs from the stores to Marin's workroom when she came around the corner of the lower hall and stopped. The man at the far end of the hall had his back to her, reading something from a dispatch that one of the runners held up for him. He was tall enough that the low arch of the passage framed him narrowly, and he stood in the particular stillness of someone whose body conserves itself, who does not move unnecessarily, whose quiet is not the quiet of inaction, but of compressed readiness. His hair was dark, close cropped at the neck. His coat was plain, oiled leather over a heavy wool shirt, the kind of practical garment that made no claim to rank because rank was not in question. He turned. She had been in the presence of powerful men before. She had stood in Aldrich's hall, in the estates of 3 other beta lords who had considered and declined to bid on her contract, in the tithe room at the Thornmere Registry. She knew what authority looked like when it was performed. This was different. This was the stillness that lives at the center of something very large that is deciding whether to move. His eyes found her and stayed, and for one moment, under the weight of that attention, the herbs in her arms smelled suddenly, absurdly, of turned earth in spring, the particular scent that means something buried is about to surface. The sensation lasted less than 2 breaths. She filed it away and held his gaze and waited for him to tell her to leave. You came from Thornmere, he said. Yes. On foot. Through the gorge. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Something in the quality of his stillness shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a compass needle settling. Then he said, See Marin about the store's rotation. We're low on black root. And looked back at the dispatch. She walked the remaining distance to the workroom with her spine very straight and her face entirely neutral, and did not allow herself to think about the way that simple sentence had landed, or the fact that the scent of turned earth had followed her down the hall. It was Marin who introduced her to the chains 3 days later. The king's manacles were kept in the lower armory, as was customary for a border keep. Silver-forged links used for holding wolves during judgment proceedings, heavy and cold and capable of suppressing the shift for as long as 40 hours. Someone had gotten into the armory stores. Marin had noticed it first, the particular greenish residue along the inner links of the 3 pairs that hung nearest the door, faint as old moss, easy to mistake for standard tarnish if you did not know what you were looking at. Caspian knew. Wolfsbane oil, concentrated and dried on metal, reactivated by body heat and the oils of skin contact. Not a quick poison. It would take 3 nights of wearing to accumulate enough compound in the body to begin the organ cascade. And the king had been wearing a single training pair during the last 2 sparring sessions with his guards, a habit he held to when demonstrating the suppression procedure to younger wolves. Marin said, If he wears them again before they are treated, by the 3rd night he will be too weakened to stand. Caspian said, I can compound the draw wash. She had already been thinking through the formula, Blackroot concentrate to break the oil's bond with the silver, powdered alum to pull the residue without corroding the link. The ratio from memory, precise as a carved measurement. It will take 3 nights to complete properly. The compound has to dry between treatments or the draw is incomplete. Marin looked at her for a moment with those dark, measuring eyes. You'll have to treat them in his presence. The second and third wash require the links to be worn, briefly, so the heat of contact activates the remaining compound before the draw can work. Caspian kept her face neutral. I understand. She brought the issue to Rowan herself. She told him plainly what she had found in the armory, what the residue was, what the timeline would have been. She did not elaborate or perform alarm. She stated facts the way Marin had taught her to state them, precisely and without decoration. He listened with his arms folded and his eyes on her, and when she finished he was quiet long enough that she wondered if she had misread something, if the directness had been a mistake. Then he said, "How did you identify it?" She told him about her training briefly. He nodded once and said, "Proceed." And that was the conversation. She treated the chains in the armory for the first night alone, laying the draw-wash compound along each link with a narrow brush Marin lent her, taking care with the ratio, working by the light of a single oil lamp while the winter wind moved in the keep's outer walls. The second night, she brought the treated pair to the small chamber Rowan used as a reading room. He was reading when she arrived, a dispatch on one knee, his coat off, his shirt loose at the collar in the way of a man who had given up on warmth as a pretense. He extended his wrist without being asked, and she fitted the link and checked the clasp, and began the activating wash, her small brush moving along the metal while the compound heated and the residue darkened briefly and then lightened. The room was quiet except for the fire and her own careful breathing. "You overheard Sivan in the corridor today," he said. She did not look up. "Yes." "Tell me what he said." Caspian had been turning over the question of whether to report this since that afternoon. She had been on her way back from the stores, past the corridor that led to the upper guest rooms, when she had heard Sivan's voice behind a half-latched door. He was speaking to someone she could not see, his voice careful and low and carrying the particular flatness of a man rehearsing a plan he had been nursing for a long time. He had spoken of Aldrich, of the sale bond, of the Blood Moon Council, of the document that could be tabled as legal claim within the Reach's own tribunal, forcing the king to adjudicate rather than simply override. He had spoken of timing, specifically of the king's weakened state, the wolfsbane doing its work, and of how a man who could barely hold the shift would find it difficult to command a council chamber of 43 lords and pack representatives without appearing diminished. She told Rowan all of it, in order, without omitting the part about the weakening. His jaw tightened very slightly when she named Sevan. His wrist was still under her brush. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment, and in that silence she felt the weight of what had just been laid out between them. His own court advisor had poisoned his chains to bring him low before a council that would decide whether a woman he had sheltered could be returned to a beta lord who had sold her for 14 silver marks. "He believes you will be weakened enough to concede," she said. "He is wrong," Rowan said, and looked at her for the first time since she had entered the room, the full weight of his attention. Not the casual surveillance of earlier days, but something more direct, more arrived at. For a single, involuntary moment, something moved behind his eyes, a jolt that he closed over quickly, the way a man presses a hand to a wound he does not mean to show. "Finish the treatment," he said. She finished it. She did not sleep well that night, and it was not because of Sevan or the council. It was the quality of that moment, the look that he had shut down before she could fully read it, and the fact that she had wanted to read it, which was its own complication she had not budgeted for. Aldrich arrived on the 4th morning. She knew he was at the gate before Marin told her, because the keep changed character the way a room changes when something with teeth enters it. The guards stood differently. The runner coming from the gate took the corridor at a faster pace than usual. Marin appeared in the workroom doorway and said simply, "He is here." And the two of them looked at each other, and Caspian set down her brush. She heard the exchange in the outer hall from the workroom passage. Aldrich's voice was smooth and carefully controlled, the voice of a man who knew his position and had decided that courtesy would work faster than aggression, at least for the opening move. He had brought a copy of the contract, he said, properly sealed and witnessed, filed with the Thornmere Registry and the Pack Lord's seal intact. He had come, in good faith, to recover what was his. Rowan's voice was shorter and lower. She is under treatment of an injury sustained on the border crossing. She does not travel in her present condition. My lord, the contract is legal by 3 witnesses and— I know what the contract says, Aldrich. Something in the particular weight he gave the beta's name made the air in the passage go still. She does not travel. That is my determination as keeper of this hold. There was a pause. Then Aldrich said pleasantly, "Of course, my lord, I will wait." He was given a guest room, and his 2 attendants were quartered in the outer ward. Caspian remained in the workroom, and then in the healing rooms, and then in the store's corridor, and Rowan did not summon her or seek her out, but on 2 separate occasions during that day she found that a guard had been posted quietly at the passage that connected her part of the keep to the guest wing. Positioned facing the guest wing's direction, she noted this and filed it without comment. The 3rd treatment night came. She brought the chains to the reading room at the same hour. Rowan extended his wrist with the same economy of gesture. The fire was lower tonight, and the room felt smaller, or perhaps it was only that she had become accustomed to it, and it no longer intimidated her in the way that new spaces do. She was midway through the activating wash when he said, "The council meets at the Blood Moon, 10 days. I know. Savan has already sent the summons on Aldrich's behalf. The sale bond will be presented as a legal claim before the full assembly." He looked at the fire rather than at her. 43 lords and pack representatives. A formal judgment can only be voided by evidence of coercion, and the evidence must come from within the Reach's own documented record. He paused. Or from testimony before the council itself. Caspian worked the compound along the last 2 links, careful with the ratio. The contaminated chains are evidence. Savan's plan to weaken you before the vote is a form of coercion by any structural reading. If it can be proven, yes. I can testify to what I found in the armory. The residue is documented by Marin. The formula is traceable to a specific wolfsbane oil compound that I can identify under questioning. She lifted the brush, checked the work, set it down. That proves the poisoning. It proves Savan's intent to compromise your authority before the council. It does not by itself prove that the sale bond itself was coerced. No, he agreed. It does not. He looked at her then, and this time he did not close the thing behind his eyes. Or perhaps he chose not to, or perhaps it had grown large enough that it could not be closed. Your mother's name was Vesa of the Lorne line. Her Luna status was registered and then suppressed. I have the original document from the Northern Archive. Marin brought it to me this morning. He said this carefully, as a man does when he is handing something fragile across a distance, and is not certain of the reception. The suppression was performed by the Thornmere Registry Office, countersigned by Aldrich's father's estate. The workroom had been cold. This room was warm. The fire popped once. "The Lorne line gives you standing," he said, "not given by this room or by my judgment. Standing that was already yours, that was taken by administrative fraud, and can be restored by the same council that will hear the bond claim." Caspian was quiet for a moment. The brush was still in her hand. She set it down on the cloth beside the chain. If the council recognizes the Lorne line, the sale was never legal. You cannot sell a registered Luna line without a full pack tribunal. Her voice was level. She was working through the logic because it was easier to work through the logic than to feel what it meant that her mother's name had been in an archive somewhere, intact, waiting. Aldrich knew this. Sevan knew this. The suppression was the precondition for the sale, Rowan said. The chain poisoning was the precondition for getting the council to ratify rather than reject it. If I am too weakened to override, the council defaults to the documentary evidence, and the documentary evidence, as falsified, supports Aldrich's claim. He paused. You understand the shape of it. I understand the shape of it, she said. The fire held. Outside, the wind had come up and was working at the keep's eastern face with the persistence of something that did not tire. Caspian looked at his wrist, where the treated links rested, and then she looked at his face, and she said, You are telling me this because you need me to speak at the council. I am telling you this, he said, and his voice was quieter now, stripped of its authority register, carrying only the particular weight of honesty. Because you deserve to know what was done to your mother. The council is a separate matter. She held that for a moment. Then she said, I will speak at the council. He did not thank her. He was not a man who thanked through words what he intended to demonstrate through action. But when she gathered her materials and rose to leave, he said her name, just once, the 2 syllables, and when she stopped he said, The guard on your passage remains until the council is done. She left before she could say something she was not prepared to mean. The blood moon rose on the 10th night of the 2nd winter month. A swollen amber disk that turned the frozen courtyard tiles, the color of cooled iron, and threw long shadows through every unshuttered window in the keep. The council chamber had been prepared in the great hall, the trestle tables arranged in the traditional judgment configuration, the pack lord's seat on its raised dais, the assembly benches filling both sides of the room. When Caspian entered with Marin at her left shoulder, every seat was occupied. 43 lords and pack representatives, their banners competing overhead, their expressions varying between wariness and the particular blankness of men determined to reveal nothing until the political weather was clear. Aldrich stood at the presentation table with the contract before him, unrolled and weighted at both corners. Sevan stood 3 steps behind him, his hands folded, his face as composed as a man who has arranged the furniture of a room to his satisfaction and is waiting for the guests to find their assigned seats. Lysara, Aldrich's displaced fiancée, sat at the far end of the first bench, her back straight and her expression sealed. Rowan entered last. He was not visibly weakened. The 3rd treatment had completed cleanly, the compound fully neutralized, Caspian's formula precise enough that the residue had drawn clear without leaving the secondary irritation that an imprecise ratio would cause. He walked to the dais with the particular gravity of a man whose authority was not housed in performance, and the assembly's noise dropped in stages as he crossed the room. Not from fear, though fear was there, but from the specific quiet that falls when something real occupies a space, and the smaller things around it stop for a moment to be still. He sat. The chief council elder rose. Aldrich presented his claim first, as petitioner. He was efficient and smooth, 3 years of contract law condensed into 6 minutes, his voice steady, his references precise, his manner that of a man who had rehearsed this performance often enough to have worn the anxiety out of it. The contract. 14 silver marks, 3 witnesses, registry seal. The flight. Documented abandonment of a contracted obligation, grounds for enforcement. The remedy. Immediate return of the contracted party to Thornmere, under the council's formal authority. The assembly listened. Sevan watched Rowan with the particular attention of a man checking the weather. Caspian rose. She had no counsel, no document in her hands except the 2 that Marin had prepared. The armory inventory showing the wolfsbane residue with the formula identification and the date, and the archive copy of her mother's Luna registration from the Northern records, her mother's name written in ink that was 40 years old, intact and recognized. She placed both documents on the council table and began to speak. She spoke first about the chains because that was the cleanest ground, the most documentable. She named the compound, the concentration, the timeline of exposure. She named the 3 pairs of manacles that had been treated, and she named the compound's effect on the shift suppression and the organ cascade that would have followed 3 nights of wearing. She named the date the treatment had begun and the date of the council, and let the assembly do the arithmetic. She explained that the treatment had required 3 nights, which was why she had been in the keep, which was why she had been present in the reading room, which was why she had been in the corridor when Savon's voice had come through the half-latched door. She repeated, in full, every sentence she had heard. She did not elaborate. She did not interpret. She stated what she had heard, word by word, the way her mother had taught her to describe what she saw without ornamentation. The assembly was very quiet. She laid the second document on the table. She explained the Lorne line briefly, her mother's name, the registration date, the suppression date, the office and the countersignature. She did not accuse Aldrich directly. She did not need to. The countersignature was his father's seal, and the name on the suppression order was Aldrich's estate trustee, the same trustee to whom the 14 silver marks had been paid. You could not sell a registered Luna line without a full pack tribunal. There had been no tribunal. The suppression had made the sale appear legal by removing the record that would have prevented it. The sale bond was founded on a falsified registry. The falsification had been performed by Aldrich's estate to enable the sale. The chain poisoning had been designed to prevent the Alpha King from being strong enough to override the council's default ruling. Every element of the arrangement had been constructed to move Caspian from one man's possession to another's, with the Alpha King's own authority used as the instrument of transfer, while his voice was being systematically silenced by a compound ground into his own manacles. She stepped back from the table. The assembly's quiet had become a different kind of quiet. Savon moved first. He spoke quickly, his voice very controlled, offering a counter-reading of the armory records, an alternate explanation for the residue, a suggestion that the archive document was of uncertain provenance. He was good at this, the precise management of doubt, the careful insertion of uncertainty into the clean line of evidence. He had been doing it for years. He was still doing it as Rowan rose from the dais. Rowan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said, "Savon, be quiet." And the room obeyed him the way the room always obeyed him, completely and without negotiation. Then he looked at Aldrich. In the silence, with the blood moon's amber light coming through the high windows and laying itself across the flagstones in broad orange bars, Rowan said, "The sale bond is voided. The registry suppression is fraudulent by the Northern Reach's own foundational law, and no contract built on a falsified record has standing in this council or any other. This woman was never legally contracted to any man in this room." He paused, and in the pause the assembly held its collective breath, and then he said, quietly enough that the room had to lean toward him to hear, "She is, instead, recognized before this council as Caspian of the Lorne line, heir to a registered Luna bloodline, and she stands here under my protection and my claim." Savon made a sound that was not quite a word. Aldrich went very still. Rowan's eyes moved from the council table to Caspian's face, and he said, as though the 43 lords and pack representatives were not present, or perhaps precisely because they were, "If she will have it." The room did not breathe. Caspian had rehearsed a great many things in her life. She had rehearsed how to compress her face under humiliation, how to speak precisely when her voice wanted to break, how to hold ground in a room where every other person had decided she was not worth addressing. She had not rehearsed this. She had, in particular, not rehearsed, standing in front of 43 witnesses and feeling the word recognition land in her chest like something that had been waiting a very long time to find its address. She said, "Yes." The false bond shattered. Not metaphorically. The contract document on the council table caught a light that had not been there before, a pale gold that ran along the paper's edge like heat, and the registry seal split clean across its center, and the paper curled at the corners the way parchment does when fire touches it, except that there was no fire. The bond chain's magic, the contract's compulsive weight in the pack world's supernatural law, broke at the point of the Alpha King's vocal declaration before witnesses, and the room felt it like a pressure released, a sound that had been too low to hear suddenly gone. Aldrich moved for the door. He did not reach it. The council guard was faster and had been watching for exactly that movement since Caspian had begun her testimony. They were thorough about it, and the chief council elder, whose face was very pale and very precise, stood and read the judgment charge in full. Conspiracy to falsify a pack registry, deliberate coercion of a bonded contract, and the poisoning of the Alpha King's court armory, with intent to compromise his authority before a formal tribunal. The charge carried a single penalty under Northern Reach law, one that had not been applied in 11 years, and was applied now with the full weight of 43 witnesses, and a king who had survived what had been designed to kill him. Aldrich Vane did not leave the keep. Sivan was stripped of his rank and his council position before the assembly finished rising from their seats. The chief elder personally removed the advisor's ring and set it on the table, and Sivan stood without speaking while the guard's manacles, the untreated pair, went on his wrists. He was to be removed from the reach in chains, and the chain on his wrists was clean silver, and he had engineered that particular sensation for someone else entirely. The assembly knelt. Not all at once, and not with enthusiasm in every case, and that was fine. That was honest. Lysara was the last to lower herself, her spine as straight in the kneeling as it had been in the sitting, her expression that of a woman who understood the mathematics of a situation and was too intelligent to refuse them. She knelt. The amber light lay across the flagstones and across the bowed necks of 43 witnesses, and the blood moon held its position in the high windows as if it too was staying to see this done properly. Marin did not kneel. She stood at the back of the assembly and watched with her dark eyes and nodded once, to herself. The small nod of a woman filing something under confirmed. In the days that followed, Thornmere's registry sent a corrected document. The Lorne Line's restoration was entered into the Northern Reach's formal record under the Chief Elder's seal and the Alpha King's counter-signature. Caspian's name appeared 17 times in that document, which was 6 more than Rowan's, a fact she noted and said nothing about. Marin, who had quietly furnished the archive copy and the armory testimony and the formula documentation, was given a formal appointment as the Reach's senior healer and the specific title that came with it. And when the appointment letter was read to her, she folded it carefully and put it in her coat and went back to her workroom without ceremony. The new year came in on a morning of flat white sky and motionless cold, the kind of cold that does not threaten, that simply is, settled and permanent. The winter passed its violent stage and into its patient one. Caspian stood in the doorway of the reading room that had been Rowan's, and was now, in the way of rooms that witness things, somehow larger in her memory than in its stone and mortar fact. She was holding the vial of black root concentrate, turning it in her fingers. Marin had pressed it into her hands a month ago with the words, "Keep it close." She had kept it close. She had used it, precisely, at precisely the moment it was needed. Rowan came to the doorway behind her. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of his presence, the economy of it. He stood at her left shoulder, looking at the courtyard where the first gray light was softening the snow, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, The council formally recognizes the Lorne line as lunar rank within the Northern Reach. I know. I was there. You were. A pause. There are 43 lords who will require introduction at some point in the next season. I am aware. Another pause. She could feel him looking at the side of her face, not trying to read it from a distance now, not pressing the assessment through a political filter. Just looking. You could have left, he said. Before the council. When you overheard Sivan. You had a route north through the ridge markers. You knew the geography. Yes. Why did you stay? She turned the vial over once more in her fingers. The black root was dark behind the glass, dense and exact. She had ground the formula from memory, the ratio precise as a carved measurement, and it had held. It had held for 3 nights and through a council chamber and through a document whose seal had split itself in two. Because you needed the treatment completed, she said, and because the truth about my mother's name was in this keep, and no one was going to carry it into that room for me. Rowan's hand came to rest on the door frame, just above and to her right, and in the cold morning air she felt the warmth of it, the specific warmth of his presence, which had been organizing her awareness of rooms since the first morning she had turned a corner in this keep and found him reading a dispatch. He said, "Caspian." She turned to look at him. The scarred knuckles of his right hand were open against the doorframe stone, not gripping, not pressing, simply resting there, open, the way a man holds his hand when he has given up on pretending he is not reaching. She placed the vial in her coat pocket. She had kept it close. She could keep it there. Outside, in the pale courtyard, the snow had stopped at last.